WP-Get Web Dev Tutorials for all user levels. Okay, so today I want to talk about being able to hide elements per session or persistently without using any plugins. So we've got some code that I'm going to share for this. So the session hiding will store a variable in your session storage, which means when you close your browser and reopen it, it's a new session. So it's only once per browser session. Persistent storage is your local storage, which is persistent between sessions. So if you close your browser, open your browser again, it's going to persist unless you clear your cache for that browser. So that's the two different ways we're going to do it. So having a look at the test page I've got here, I've got my Chrome DevTools and the application tab open. And what we're going to look at first is our session storage. So if we look under our website address here, which is my dev site, I've got no variable in there for this here. If I click on this first heading session 1, I get a variable in my local session storage called WPG_show_test, which is a prefix, and then the ID of the actual heading. And it's showing it's been closed and it's disappeared. Okay, so if I click the heading 2 persistent, it doesn't show up in our session storage, it shows up in our local storage. So the same prefix, and then heading 2 is my ID of that element. So if I was to close my browser now and reopen it, heading 2 would still be hidden, but heading 1 would come back because this gets cleared each time you open your browser. So hopefully that makes sense. Now with the alert, same deal. I've just got it clickable on the whole alert at the moment, but you'd implement this however you wanted. So let's say we close that alert. Now I've got a test alert in my session storage. So if I close my browser and reopen my browser, it's going to show that alert. If I save it in persistent storage, the local storage, it won't show it next time I open my browser. I've then just got an event on this button here where I've told to clear all of those variables that I've saved. I'm going to do Control F5 and I've got my alert back. The reason that's hiding is because there's an event attached to the alert which hides it in its own way. But the persistent storage would be if I close this alert and then I do a Control F5, it's not showing. If I clear the storage, then it's come back again. All right, so that's what we're going to achieve today. So I'll share this code out in the tutorial. So basically what we've got up here is we've got a heading, I've given it an ID, and I've set 3 attributes here. So the first attribute is data, show once per session. Don't need any value for that, so it's just as long as that's there, it's going to show it once per session. I've got a data close on event name. So what event do I want this to close on? So at the moment I've just got it, as soon as I hit the click, it's going to run this event, it's going to close that and save it to, in this case, the per session storage. And I've got this extra attribute here, which I'm telling it to actually hide the element on that event. So I'll show you how that works as well. Just in case, you might have something that automatically hides it and you don't need to do this. For example, the alert, as soon as I click the button on the alert, it will hide it by itself, so I don't really need to hide it. But generally, it's okay to do that. All right, so that's the 3 attributes that I've got there. Now on the heading 2, I've got an ID of test heading 2, attributes. The only difference between these 2 attributes is the first one, the 3 I should say, and that's called data show once persistent. Okay, that's going to put it in the local storage. That's all I have to do for that. Now the alert, same deal. I've got a test ID, which is called test alert, attributes, once per session, on click, and we can actually take that out because it's the alert was going to hide it once we click the button anyway. I'll leave it actually there for now, so it just makes sense. All right, so that's all we have to do to make these things work with the code I'm going to show you. I've then got some other code so I can clear those out. Heading over to the code, and again, I'll make this all available to you. I always start, when I'm going to expose functions to the window object, I always define a object. In my case, I call it _WPG. If it hasn't been defined by anything else yet, just make that an empty object. And we're going to actually add to that down the track by storage prefix, so the WPG show. So that was the, if I look here, yeah, let's just get rid of that. That was in our local storage, session storage. So WPG _show_ is the prefix, and then we got the ID on that. So that's the prefix we want. The session element selector, so these are the ones that we want to display per session. If it's got that data attribute, which we showed you on each of these, then that's the selector we want for that. We're then creating 3 ES6 functions, one to set the session variable. We get the ID of the element. What do we want to set it to? Doesn't really matter in this case. We're then creating a variable name from our prefix plus the ID of that element. And then under the session storage, which is a built-in browser API, we're setting the item with the variable name and using JSON to stringify the value just in case it is an object, because you can't store objects. You can only store strings. All right, and I've got some debugging. If the debug is enabled, then we're going to console info out session set with a variable name. We'll bring that over to this screen, have a look at my console. So you can see here, that's what the console logging does with debugging. All right, so session get var is same deal. Get the variable name from the storage prefix plus the ID, debug it, and then return a JSON passed string from the session storage with that variable name. Session clear, same deal, same variable name, and then session storage remove item. So that just clears it out of the session storage. And then we just duplicate that same thing down here, but we're using the data show once persistent, and we've got 3 different functions for the same thing with our persistent storage, which is the local storage. All right. Now we've got some common functions. We'll come back to this process close and trigger first. Soon, I should say. And we'll go down to the event listener here. So on the window, we've got an event listener for DOM content loaded. So we want to get a selection of all of the elements that we're tracking for this storage. We get all of those. We're calling maybe hide elements. Now maybe hide elements will iterate through all of the elements that have that selector. And if the variable name exists in your persistent storage or your session storage, then we want to add WPG hide. So if it exists in the storage, add the hide class to it. And down the bottom here, I've just got WPG hide equals display none. Okay, so that's basically passing through all of those. Now there is a caveat on this. So I noticed that when I'm waiting for DOM content to load before I run that, I'm getting the element shows briefly as it renders and then it disappears. So I'm actually exposing this method so you can run it before DOM content loaded, which I'll talk about shortly, and it works better that way. All right, now what we're doing is getting all of the elements, iterate through those, get the ID of the element, and then we're going to process those elements. All right, so processing the elements is basically we get the ID from the element. So every element that we've set up here, we then get the data from the data set, get the event name. So what do we want to trigger on? Then we trigger on the event name. So this could be any script. You could actually have a script which throws or dispatches a JavaScript event on window, and that will work just as well. Okay. Then we basically get our target. So which one actually triggered the event? Now, is it a session or a persistent one? So we look for the show once per session. That's our constant there. Going to get rid of this console log. I thought I left that there. Okay. Now, if the data set has a hide on event, if it's not defined, not undefined I should say, then we want to add the WPG hide class. So it's pulled the variable out, it's existing, we're telling it to hide when we click that, so hide it. All right. If we are not using a session, so it's undefined, we want to use our persistent storage. So that's the local storage. Otherwise, if it is a session, we want to save it in our session by session set var. All right, so listen for a click event in this case. Are we going to save this in the session? Yes. Use this function here. If no, use this function here. So that's pretty much how it works. We then have, remember the object that we defined up here, the WPG object on window? What we're doing now is we're setting a property called Conditional Display, and we're going to expose all of these methods that we want. So we can actually set variables, clear them, however we want from externally. We're going to use a show element in this example here, and then maybe hide elements. So down further, you see I've called window, WPG, conditional display, maybe hide elements. Now this will run before DOM content loaded, and it will hide these before you actually get to see them. But the condition is that this has to be run after those elements are on the page. So I would not run this here. This is only for demonstration purposes. I would actually pull this out and stick it into a code manager and make sure it's in the footer, which I'll show you shortly. Okay, that's pretty much what we're doing with that. All right, so the next thing we want is the closing or clearing of these. So basically I've got a button here. I've just given it an ID of clear storage vars. Got another JavaScript down here, which is going to get that element, add an event listener for click, prevent the default on that button. We want to get our functions from WPG conditional display. So remember back here, we exposed all of these functions to window, WPG conditional display, and this is how we access them. So when you press the button, we're just going to get a constant, which is that object, and we're going to call that with show element test heading 1, show element test heading 2, and show element test alert. So click that button and it calls that function. Now having a look at that function, show element, okay, so we get the ID, so we get the DOM element with that ID. We then remove the WPG hide, so we want it to be shown. We clear our session var for that ID, and we clear our persistent var for that ID. So we clear out of both because we want to show it now. That's pretty much all there is to this. You can, while you're testing, to also go into the application and tell it to delete those. For example, if I go into the session storage and persistent storage and hide those, they will now show up in, is it there? I can just go into my application, delete that, go to my session storage, delete that, and then do a Control F5. So for testing, you can do that. But if you want a button to clear it, then you can do that as well. All right, so hopefully that's something that's you find useful. It's a good way of doing it without using any plugins. I do have a preference for using things like dynamic ooze, conditional displays, because with that you can actually decide to not even put the element in the DOM if it's hidden, which is better than actually hiding it even though it's in the DOM. But this is a very, very easy way of doing it. If you don't have dynamic ooze or anything else with a conditional display, it's a very, very easy way, very good way of doing it. But one thing I forgot, I ended the recording and then I came back and realized I forgot to mention this. So when I use these HTML widgets for creating code like this, I generally use them only for creating the code. Once I've done it, I move them to a code manager, so I don't end up with code all over the place. So I'm going to show you how I do that in this case. So I'm going to grab all of this code here between the script blocks. I'm going to cut it out of there. I don't want my code there. I'll then go to, I'm using WP Code Box, and I've got a couple of things I've created here. One called Conditional Display, or should be Conditional Display. What I do is I paste my code into here, This is inline JavaScript. I'll minify it. I want it in the footer, and I only want it on the front end. All right, so that's the code there. Save that, and then enable it. All right. For my CSS, I just grab that there, and I go to my common CSS file that I've created. I add that, and I make sure with the CSS, I make sure it's again minified. I put it in the header and only on the front end. So CSS I want in the header because it can affect the display. The JavaScript I put in the footer because it needs to run after the elements have loaded. So now I've taken that out. So let's come back to here. I can actually delete this whole code block. I've got no more HTML5 there. So I've got no more HTML widget there. The only HTML widget is for the clearing the storage which is on this page. So I'm going to update that. Come back and just check that my code is working. No console errors, and I've got all my code there. So if I look at the session 1, done. Session 2, done. Clear the storage. Okay. For some reason I'm not getting my alert. Clear the storage. All right, so I've messed up something with the alert. What is that? So to debug this, I'm going to come back and turn off the minifying, save that. Probably good that it didn't work, so I can show you some debugging. All right, so console, clear the storage vars, can't read the class list, WPG hide for an element. So I've lost something here. Now let's go back to it. On here, I've got test alert. That's what I've changed. I forgot to change that. And I was clearing it. So it wasn't what I just did. It was the JavaScript was trying to clear a test alert, not test alert 2. So I go back now. There we go there. Console. Close that. Control F5. Gone. Close that. Close that. Control F5. Gone. So the alert comes up very, very quickly doing that because it's in the footer. So there is a little bit of a delay. If I just do an F5, does it happen? It does. Okay. So with a bit of caching, that's probably not going to happen. But putting it in the footer is actually giving me a little bit of a flicker there. So you might actually want to put some extra classes in there to hide that while it's actually processing. So that's it. That's pretty much how I would do this. It's a way of doing it without having to buy and install plugins. It does require a little bit of thinking to get it right, but it's very, very flexible. So I really hope you enjoy that. So I hope you appreciate that. And if you like this kind of thing, please subscribe. Please hit the like button. And yeah, have fun.